Tonight we follow the greatest empire the Western world has ever known, from its very first day to its last. A story that begins with two abandoned infants left to die by a river, and ends, more than a millennium later, with barbarian kings sitting on the throne of the Caesars. We have touched the edges of this story before, you and I. We stood in a small Roman town on the last ordinary day of its life, beneath a mountain no one knew was a volcano. We watched a mad emperor sing while his city burned. We saw a Greek queen of Egypt gamble her kingdom against Rome's rising power and lose. Tonight we go back to the beginning of all of it and follow the whole immense arc. How a village of shepherds on a muddy hill in Italy became the master of the entire known world, and how that mastery, in the end, rotted and cracked and fell. Think of the span of it. Rome endured, in one form or another, for more than 1,000 years, longer than any nation now alive has existed. It conquered from the mists of Britain to the sands of Arabia. It built roads still walked upon today, laws still argued in our courtrooms, and words still spoken in half the languages of the Western world. And then it fell, slowly, painfully, in a collapse so total that people would spend the next 15 centuries trying to understand how such a thing could possibly happen. So settle in. We have all night, and the whole rise and fall of Rome to drift through. And it begins, as the Romans themselves insisted, with a story of blood between brothers. The Romans told a story about how their city began, and though it is myth rather than history, they believed it utterly, and it tells you everything about how they saw themselves. There was a princess, the story goes, in an old Italian town, forced into a life of sacred chastity by a usurping king who feared her children might one day take back the throne he had stolen. But the god of war himself came to her, and she bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus. The king, terrified, ordered the infants drowned in the river. The servant charged with the deed could not bring himself to do it, and instead set the babies adrift in a basket on the flooding water, leaving them to the will of the gods. The basket came to rest at the foot of a hill, and there the twins were found, not by a person, but by a she-wolf who had come down to drink. And instead of devouring them, she suckled them and kept them alive, this wild animal nursing two human infants at the water's edge. It is the founding image of Rome, cast in bronze 1,000 times over, stamped on its coins and standards forever after. Two babies feeding at the belly of a wolf. The Romans looked at that image and saw themselves, nursed on the milk of a predator, made hard and fierce from their very first hour. A shepherd found them and raised them, and they grew into strong and formidable young men. And in time they learned who they truly were, overthrew the usurping king, and restored their grandfather to his throne. And then they decided to found a city of their own, on the hills above the river where the wolf had found them. But the brothers quarreled over which hill to build on, and who should rule, and how the gods should be read. And in that quarrel, the story turns dark in a way the Romans never flinched from. Romulus began to build a wall around his chosen hill, and Remus, mocking his brother, leapt contemptuously over the little wall to show how worthless it was. And Romulus killed him, struck his own twin brother dead for the insult, and declared over the body that so should perish anyone else who leapt the walls of his city. That is how Rome began, in its own founding story, with a man murdering his brother over a wall. The Romans did not hide this or apologize for it. They told it, generation after generation, as the honest truth of their origin. There is something chilling and revealing in a people whose founding myth is a fratricide, a civilization that understood from its first breath that it was born in blood, that its walls were sacred beyond kinship, and that anything, even a brother, could be sacrificed for the city. Rome was named for the twin who killed, and Romulus became its first king, on a hill above the river, with a village of shepherds and outlaws and runaways for his people. in the year the Romans reckoned as their beginning, 753 years before our era. Nobody watching that muddy little settlement of huts on a hilltop could possibly have imagined what it would become. For its first 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings, 7 of them, in the traditional telling, each one remembered for the particular gift he gave the growing city. Romulus, the founder, gave it war and its first people, and he solved a very practical problem in a brutal way. His village of outlaws and shepherds had almost no women and no future without them. So Romulus invited the neighboring people, the Sabines, to a great festival, and at his signal, the Roman men seized the Sabine women and carried them off. It brought immediate war, of course, and the Sabines marched on Rome to take their daughters back. But the story ends strangely. When the two armies met, the women themselves ran between them and stopped the battle, pleading that they could not bear to see their fathers kill their husbands, or their husbands kill their fathers. And the two peoples, instead of destroying each other, merged into one. It is another founding story that tells you much about Rome, violence, and then absorption. Rome took what it wanted, and then made the taken part of itself. That pattern would repeat for 1,000 years. The kings who followed each added something. One gave Rome its religion, its calendar, and its priesthoods, teaching this warlike people to fear and honor the gods. Others gave it war and conquest, extending its power over neighboring towns. One built the great sewer that drained the marshy valley between the hills and made the heart of the city habitable, creating the open space that would become the Forum, the beating heart of Roman public life for the next millennia. Another built the first great walls. Another reorganized the whole population into classes by wealth and military duty, laying the foundations of the Roman state. And the last 3 kings were Etruscans, from the sophisticated, mysterious civilization to the north that dominated early Italy, and from whom the rough Romans learned an enormous amount. Engineering, urban planning, religious ritual, the arts of building and drainage, and civilization itself. Under these Etruscan kings, Rome grew from a village into a real city, walled, drained, templed, and powerful. But the last of those kings was a tyrant. He seized the throne by murder, ruled by fear and violence without the consent of the Senate, executed the men who opposed him, and treated the city as his personal possession. The Romans called him Tarquin the Proud, and they came to hate him. And the thing that finally broke the monarchy was a crime committed not by the king himself, but by his son. The prince, staying as a guest in the house of a nobleman, became obsessed with his host's wife, a woman named Lucretia, famed for her virtue and her modesty. And one night, he came to her room with a sword and forced himself upon her, threatening to kill her and disgrace her name forever if she resisted. What followed made a revolution. Lucretia sent for her father and her husband, told them plainly what the king's son had done, made them swear to avenge her, and then, before they could stop her, drew a knife she had hidden and killed herself in front of them, rather than live with the dishonor. Her body was carried out into the Forum, and the city erupted. A nobleman named Brutus, who had spent years feigning stupidity to survive the tyrant's suspicion, pulled the bloody knife from Lucretia's body, held it up before the people, and swore a terrible oath that he would drive out the king and his whole family, and that never again, so long as Rome stood, would any man be permitted to rule as king in this city. The people rose. The royal family was expelled, the monarchy abolished forever, and the tyrant's line driven into exile. And in its place, the Romans created something new, a government without a king, in which power was shared, limited, and temporary, and in which the very word for king became the foulest insult in the language, a charge that could destroy any man accused of it. They called it the Republic, the public thing, and with its birth, in the year 509 before our era, the true history of Rome begins. The Romans, having thrown out their king, faced a hard question. How do you run a state without one? Their answer was one of the most influential political inventions in human history, and its logic echoes in half the governments on Earth today. Their central obsession was simple. Never again should one man hold all the power. So they broke the king's power into pieces and set the pieces against each other. Instead of one ruler for life, they elected two chief magistrates, called consuls, and gave them the king's authority jointly, but only for a single year, after which they stepped down and answered for what they had done. Two men, so each could veto and check the other. 1 year, so no one could entrench. It was the ancestor of every system of term limits and divided executives that has followed. Beneath and around the consuls stood a whole ladder of other offices, each with its own duties and its own limits, which an ambitious Roman climbed in order over the course of his career. And at the center sat the Senate, a council of the leading men, mostly former magistrates who served for life. The Senate could not strictly command, it advised, but its advice carried the accumulated authority of Rome's most experienced men, and in practice it steered the state for centuries. Its decrees opened with the letters that would become the emblem of Rome itself, the Senate and the people of Rome, the formula stamped on standards and monuments across the world, the very definition of Roman authority. Not a king, but the Senate and the people together. And there were the assemblies, where the citizens themselves voted, on laws, on wars, on the men who would hold office. The Roman Republic was not a democracy as we understand it. It was weighted heavily toward the rich, and the votes of the wealthy counted for vastly more than the votes of the poor. But it was a state in which ordinary citizens had real rights, real votes, and real protections, and in which no man, however great, was supposed to stand above the law. But that promise was, at first, mostly a lie, because early Rome was ruled by a closed circle of aristocratic families, the patricians, who monopolized the priesthoods and the offices and the law, and who treated the common people, the plebeians, as inferiors with no real voice. The plebeians fought the wars, paid the taxes, and got nothing in return but debt and contempt. And so began a long internal struggle that lasted for centuries. It is one of the most remarkable things about early Rome, because of how it was fought. The plebeians had no army, no offices, no power. What they had was numbers, and one devastating weapon: they could simply leave. And that is what they did, again and again. When their grievances were ignored, the entire plebeian body would march out of Rome in a body and encamp on a nearby hill, refusing to work, refusing to fight, leaving the patricians alone in a city that could not function without them. A general strike, in effect, in the 5th century before our era. And it worked. Slowly, concession by concession, over 200 years, the plebeians won their rights. They won their own officials, the tribunes of the people, whose persons were sacred and who could veto any act of the state that harmed a plebeian, an extraordinary power. They forced the laws to be written down and published, so that the aristocrats could no longer simply invent them. They won the right to marry patricians, to hold every office, to enter every priesthood, and finally the right to have their assemblies' decisions bind the whole Roman people. It is a genuinely astonishing story. A long, bitter class conflict fought almost entirely without civil war, resolved by negotiation and compromise rather than slaughter, ending in a state where any citizen, however humble his birth, might in theory rise to the highest office. That capacity for compromise, for absorbing the excluded rather than crushing them, was one of the great secrets of Rome's strength. And it is worth remembering it now, at the beginning, because the day would come when Rome lost that gift entirely, and when it did, the Republic died. Before we follow the legions out into the world, let us walk a while through Rome itself. because the city was like nothing else that had ever existed, and its daily life is a world worth drifting through. At its height, Rome held perhaps 1 million people, packed into a space that would strike us as impossibly small. No city on earth would hold that many again for something like 1,500 years, and most of those million lived in a way we would find astonishing. Crammed into apartment blocks, tall ramshackle buildings of brick and timber rising 5, 6, even 7 stories, packed along narrow lanes so tight that the upper floors nearly touched overhead and blotted out the sky. The higher you lived, the poorer you were. The top floors were cheap because they were miserable. No water, no drains, reached by dark stairs, and terrifyingly likely to burn or collapse. Fire was a constant terror in a city of wooden floors and open flames, and buildings did collapse regularly, killing everyone inside. The streets were a riot. Noise, filth, crowds, hawkers, animals, refuse thrown from windows. Wheeled carts were banned during the day because the streets were too jammed to move. So the deliveries came at night, and the city rattled and rumbled through the small hours, and the poets complained bitterly that no one in Rome could ever get any sleep. It stank. It was dangerous after dark, unlit and unpoliced, full of thieves. And yet it was the most exciting place on earth, the center of the world, where every people and language and good and idea from 3 continents came flooding together. The Roman day began at first light. Romans rose early, before dawn in the summer, and got their real work done in the morning hours. A wealthy man began his day with the salutatio, a crowd of dependents and clients gathering in his atrium at daybreak to greet him, pay their respects, ask favors, and receive in return small gifts of money or food and the protection of his name. That relationship, patron and client, the powerful man and his dependents, favors flowing down and loyalty flowing up, ran through the whole of Roman society like a nervous system, binding rich to poor in a web of mutual obligation. Business was conducted in the morning. Then, around midday, the working day simply ended. Romans ate a light lunch, and then the afternoon belonged to leisure, and above all to the baths. The baths were the heart of Roman social life, and they were magnificent, not simply places to wash, but vast public complexes, open to nearly everyone for a trivial coin, where a Roman would spend hours of every afternoon. You would exercise first, then move through a sequence of rooms, a warm room to open the pores, a hot steamy chamber, a plunge into cold water at the end, while attendants scraped the oil and dirt from your skin with a curved bronze tool. And around all of it swirled the real point: talk. Gossip, business, politics, argument, friendship. There were gardens, libraries, food stalls, exercise yards. The greatest imperial baths were the size of small towns, with soaring vaulted ceilings, marble everywhere, and enough room for thousands of bathers at once. It was one of the finest things about Roman life, a daily luxury, available to almost anyone, that would not be equaled in Europe for well over 1,000 years after Rome fell. Then came dinner, the main meal, taken in the late afternoon and stretching into the evening. And for the wealthy, this was the great social event of the day. Guests reclining on couches around low tables, eating and drinking and talking for hours. And then early to bed, because tomorrow began at dawn. Roman religion was unlike anything we would recognize as faith. It was not about belief or morality or a personal relationship with a god. It was a contract. The Romans believed that the gods had power over everything: the harvest, the weather, war, childbirth, the future of the state, and that if you performed the correct rituals, precisely, with the exact words and the proper offerings, the gods would uphold their side of the bargain and grant success. If you got the ritual wrong, even in a small detail, it was void and had to be started over from the beginning. What mattered was not sincerity, but exactness. They had a great crowd of gods, many of them borrowed and reshaped from the Greeks, presiding over the state and the world. But the religion an ordinary Roman lived every day was smaller and closer to home. Every household had its own spirits, the guardians of the house, of the pantry, of the family's ancestral line, honored with small daily offerings at a little shrine by the hearth. Every crossroads had its gods, every spring, every threshold, every field. The Roman world was thick with small sacred presences that had to be respected and fed, and the father of the family was its priest, performing the rites that kept his household safe. And they were obsessed with reading the will of the gods. Before any important act of state, a battle, an election, a law, Roman officials would take the auspices, watching the flight of birds, or examining the entrails of a sacrificed animal, or noting lightning and thunder, to determine whether the gods approved. If the omens were bad, the business was postponed. There is a famous story from a great sea battle, when a Roman commander, told that the sacred chickens would not eat, a terrible omen, lost his temper and threw them overboard, snapping that if they would not eat, let them drink. He lost the battle catastrophically, and the Romans never forgot it. That was what came, they said, of mocking the gods. Half of Rome was women, and almost everything we know about them was written by men. But the shape of their lives is worth drifting through, because it is not quite what you would expect. Legally, a Roman woman had nothing. She could not vote, hold office, sit in the Senate, or command a legion. She spent her life formally under the authority of a man, her father, then her husband, then a guardian. She could be married off at 12 or 13 to a man decades older, chosen for family alliance, with no say in it. If her newborn was unwanted, her husband could order it exposed on a rubbish heap to die, and there was nothing she could do. And yet, in practice, Roman women, especially wealthy ones, had a degree of freedom that would have astonished a Greek, and that later ages lost entirely. They owned property in their own right, and a great deal of it. Roman marriage, in its common later form, did not transfer a woman into her husband's family. She stayed legally part of her father's, which meant her property stayed hers, separate from her husband's, and she took it with her if the marriage ended. And marriages ended constantly. Divorce was easy, common, unstigmatized, and available to either party. Roman women ran businesses, owned ships and brickworks and estates, made loans, freed slaves, funded temples and public buildings, and had their names carved on them. They went out. They attended dinner parties, reclining alongside the men, which scandalized Greek visitors. They went to the races and the theater and the baths. They walked the streets and shopped and gossiped. A wealthy Roman woman's daily life was, in its texture, closer to a modern one than anything Europe would see again for 18 centuries. And politically, they were everywhere, not on the record, but in the room. Augustus's wife Livia was, by any honest reading, one of the most powerful people in the empire for half a century. Mothers and wives and daughters of the great families brokered marriages, ran networks, whispered in the ears of consuls, and made and unmade careers, because in a society organized entirely around families, the women who ran the families ran a great deal. The Roman ideal held that a good woman was modest, silent, and stayed home working wool, and the fact that they had to keep saying it so loudly for so many centuries suggests it was not going terribly well. At the center of it all was the household, and at the head of the household was the father, with a legal authority over his family that is genuinely shocking. In the old law, the father of the family held, in principle, the power of life and death over his children at any age. A Roman man of 40, a senator, a general, was legally still a child in his father's house while his father lived. In practice, this power was almost never used, and by the empire it was largely a legal fossil. But it tells you how Rome thought. The family was a small state, and it had a magistrate. And Romans loved their children. The evidence is overwhelming and often unbearable. The tombstones survive in their thousands, and they are not formal. They are a father recording that his daughter lived 5 years, 6 months, and 3 days, and that she was the sweetest thing in the world, and that he does not know how to go on. Half of all Roman children died before they reached 10. Every family knew that grief, most of them repeatedly, and they wrote it on stone with a plainness that reaches straight across 2,000 years and takes hold of you. That is the thing to hold on to, drifting here in the dark, about these people who conquered the world and crucified 6,000 men along a road. They were not a different species. They loved their children and buried them and could not bear it. They worried about money and their in-laws. They complained about the noise and the traffic and the prices. They wanted socks in the winter and a good seat at the races and to be remembered. They were us in different clothes a very long time ago, and then the whole world they built came apart, and they went quiet, and all that is left is the roads, and the law and the words, and a father's tombstone for a 5-year-old girl, still legible, still breaking hearts, 2 millennia after he carved it. The young republic did not begin as a conqueror. It began as one small city among many in a crowded and dangerous Italy, surrounded by rivals, other Latin towns, hill tribes, Etruscan cities to the north, Greek colonies in the south. And for its first 2 centuries, Rome fought, almost constantly, simply to survive and to master its own neighborhood. It was a slow, brutal, unglamorous climb. War was so routine that the Roman calendar was built around it. A campaigning season each year, the army marching out in spring, coming home in autumn, year after year after year, for generations. Every Roman male citizen was a soldier when called, and the Republic's leaders were expected to have commanded in the field. War was not an interruption of Roman life. It was the fabric of it. And in the middle of that long climb came the most humiliating disaster of early Roman history, the day the city itself fell. A great horde of Gauls came down from the north, tall, fierce warriors from beyond the mountains, terrifying to the Italians who faced them. The Roman army marched out to meet them at a river a few miles from the city and was utterly shattered, broken in a single catastrophic battle, the survivors fleeing in panic. And the road to Rome lay open. The Gauls walked into the city almost unopposed. There is a story the Romans told about it that captures their idea of themselves, that the oldest senators, too old to fight and refusing to flee, dressed in their finest robes of office and sat down in the open in their courtyards, motionless, waiting, and that the Gauls, entering the silent city, came upon these ancient men sitting like statues and were so unnerved that they thought them gods, until one Gaul reached out and stroked an old senator's beard, and the senator struck him with his ivory staff, and the spell broke, and the killing began. The Gauls sacked Rome and burned it. The survivors held out on the fortified hill of the capital, besieged, starving. In the most famous moment of the siege, the Gauls attempted a silent night assault up the cliff, and the exhausted Roman sentries never heard them. But the sacred geese kept in the temple of the goddess Juno did, and their honking woke the garrison in time to hurl the attackers back. Rome was saved, the story goes, by geese. Eventually, the Romans paid the Gauls a great weight of gold to leave. And when the Romans complained that the Gallic weights used to measure the gold were rigged, the Gallic chieftain threw his sword onto the scale as well and said the words that burned themselves into Roman memory forever. Woe to the vanquished! Rome never forgot that day. The trauma of it, the city burned, the shame of paying tribute, the terror of the Gauls shaped Roman policy for centuries, feeding a deep, driving determination never to be weak again, never to be at the mercy of anyone, to make Rome so strong that no enemy could ever do that to them twice. And so they rebuilt, and they fought on. And over the next century and a half, they mastered the whole Italian peninsula, defeating one enemy after another. The fierce mountain tribes who beat them badly more than once, the Etruscan cities, the wealthy Greek colonies of the south, and even a brilliant Greek king who came to Italy with an army and wore elephants and beat the Romans twice in bloody battles, and then found that Rome simply would not stop coming, that they raised new armies after every defeat and came back at him again, until he looked at his own shattered forces after another such victory, and remarked that one more win like that would destroy him utterly. The phrase survives to this day. He went home. Rome kept coming. That was the secret. Rome lost battles constantly, sometimes catastrophically. What made it different was that it did not accept defeat. It absorbed the blow, raised another army, and came back and back and back until the enemy broke. Its manpower was enormous, and its stubbornness bottomless. And there was a second secret, subtler and more important. Rome did not simply crush the peoples it defeated. It absorbed them. Defeated Italians were bound to Rome as allies, obliged to send soldiers for Rome's wars, but left largely to run their own affairs, and offered, over time, a path to Roman citizenship itself. Rome made its enemies into Romans. Every conquest therefore added not just territory, but manpower, and every generation the pool of men who would fight and die for Rome grew larger. That is how a single city came to command the whole of Italy, and how it built the deep reservoir of strength that would soon let it take on the greatest power in the Western Mediterranean, and survive the most terrifying enemy it would ever face. Master of Italy, Rome now looked across a narrow strait and saw the island of Sicily, and beyond it, the power that owned half the Western Sea. Carthage. Carthage was everything Rome was not. It was old where Rome was young, rich where Rome was poor, a city of merchants and sailors founded by Phoenician traders on the coast of North Africa, grown fat on centuries of commerce. Its wealth was staggering. Its navy was the finest in the world, and its harbor a marvel of engineering, a great circular basin where hundreds of warships could be berthed under cover. Where Rome fought with its own citizen farmers, Carthage hired mercenaries with its gold, Spaniards, Gauls, Numidian horsemen, Balearic slingers, the best soldiers money could buy. Where Rome ruled by absorbing conquered peoples, Carthage ruled by trade and tribute. Two great powers, on either side of a narrow sea, both expanding. There was no room for both. And so began the longest and most terrible struggle of the ancient world. 3 wars across more than a century that would end with one of those cities erased from the face of the earth. The first war began over Sicily and lasted 23 brutal years, and it revealed something essential about the Roman character. Rome had no fleet. It was a land power, with no naval tradition whatsoever, facing the greatest sea power in the world. By any sane reckoning, it could not win a war fought across water. So Rome simply decided to become a naval power from nothing. The story goes that a Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast, and the Romans took it apart, studied it, and used it as a template to build an entire fleet of copies, while training crews to row on benches set up on dry land. Within a couple of years, this landlubber republic had built a war fleet from scratch and put it to sea. And since they knew they could never outsail the Carthaginians, they changed the rules. Roman engineers devised a boarding bridge, a heavy spiked gangplank mounted on the prow that could be dropped onto an enemy deck, spiking it fast, and turned every sea battle into a land battle. The Carthaginians, expecting to outmaneuver the clumsy Romans, instead found Roman legionaries storming across bridges onto their decks. Rome won victory after victory at sea, lost entire fleets to storms, hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men drowned more than once, and simply built new ones. Again, and again, until Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace and gave up Sicily. That was the pattern that made Rome terrifying. It did not have a navy, so it built one. It lost the navy, so it built another, and another. It would not stop. Carthage lost the war, lost Sicily, and was forced to pay a crushing indemnity. And in the bitter aftermath, one Carthaginian general, a brilliant, proud man named Hamilcar Barca, who had never been defeated in the field and felt his city had been betrayed by its own politicians, took his family and his army to Spain and set about building a new Carthaginian empire there in the Silver-rich mountains to replace what had been lost. And he took his young son with him. Before they sailed, the story goes, Hamilcar led the boy to an altar and had him lay his hand upon the sacrifice and made him swear an oath that as long as he lived, he would never be a friend to Rome. The boy was 9 years old. His name was Hannibal, and he would keep that oath so ferociously that he would come within a hair's breadth of destroying the Roman Republic entirely. Hannibal grew up in Spain in his father's army and became a soldier of extraordinary gifts, beloved by his men, brilliant, patient, and utterly implacable. And when he came to command, he provoked the war he had been born for. Rome expected the war to be fought in Spain or in Africa. What Hannibal did, instead, is one of the boldest strokes in all of military history. He marched. He took his army, infantry, cavalry, and 37 war elephants out of Spain, across the Pyrenees, across southern Gaul, fighting hostile tribes the whole way, forcing river crossings, and then he turned toward the Alps. Nobody brought an army over the Alps. The passes were high, brutal, snowbound by autumn, held by hostile mountain tribes who rolled boulders down onto the column and ambushed it in the narrows. Men and animals fell from the tracks into gorges. The cold killed. The paths were so narrow that landslides blocked them entirely, and the army had to hack a road out of the rock face to get the elephants through. It took about 2 weeks to cross, and it cost Hannibal something close to half his army. Tens of thousands of men lost to the mountains before he ever saw a Roman soldier. But he came down into the plains of northern Italy with a hardened core of veterans, his elephants, and something worth more than either, total surprise. Rome had not remotely imagined an enemy army could appear in Italy from the north. Hannibal was inside the house. What followed were 3 of the most crushing defeats in Roman history, delivered in barely 18 months. At a cold river in the north, Hannibal lured a Roman army across freezing water at dawn on empty stomachs, and then sprang an ambush he had hidden in the stream beds and destroyed it. Then he did something worse. Marching south, he baited a rash Roman consul into pursuing him along the shore of a misty lake, into a narrow defile between the water and the hills, and had his entire army hidden in the fog on the slopes above. The Romans marched into the trap in column, strung out, unable to form a line. When the attack came out of the mist from above, the Roman army was annihilated where it stood, thousands driven into the lake to drown in their armor, an entire consular army wiped out in a few hours. And then came the worst day in the history of the Roman Republic. Rome, enraged and desperate, raised the largest army it had ever fielded, something like 80,000 men, perhaps more, nearly double Hannibal's force, and marched to crush him at a place in the south called Cannae. Hannibal drew up his line and did something that has been studied by soldiers ever since. He made his center deliberately weak, bulging forward toward the Romans with his best troops on the wings. The huge Roman mass smashed into that center and pushed it back and back and back, and the Carthaginian line did not break. It bent, curving inward like a bag, while the Romans pressed deeper into it, delighted, certain they were winning. And then Hannibal's cavalry, having destroyed the Roman horse, came around and closed the rear, and the veteran wings turned inward, and the entire enormous Roman army found itself completely surrounded, packed so tightly it could not lift its weapons, crushed inward from every side. What happened next was not a battle. It was hours of butchery. Something like 50,000 Roman citizens and allies died in a single afternoon on that field. One of the bloodiest days in the whole of human warfare, a scale of death in one day that Europe would not see again until the industrial slaughters of the modern era. The Roman dead included a consul, dozens of senators, and a whole generation of the aristocracy. Livy wrote that the Carthaginians grew tired of killing. Any other state in the ancient world would have surrendered. Hannibal fully expected it. He had destroyed 3 Roman armies, killed a fifth of Rome's fighting men, and was standing in Italy with nothing between him and the city. By every rule of war, Rome was finished. He sent envoys to discuss terms. Rome refused to receive them, refused even to discuss peace. They banned the word peace from being spoken publicly. They forbade the women to weep in the streets so as not to damage morale. They armed slaves and criminals to fill the ranks. They raised new legions from boys. They refused to ransom their own captured soldiers. Let them rot, said the Senate, as a lesson that Romans do not surrender. They simply, flatly, refused to lose. And then they refused to fight him. A cautious commander was appointed, and he adopted a strategy that his own countrymen initially despised as cowardice. Never give Hannibal battle. Shadow him, harass him, cut his foragers, deny him supplies, and never, ever meet him in the open field where his genius could destroy another army. The Romans mocked the man as the delayer. It was an insult. It became, in time, a title of honor because it worked. Hannibal marched up and down Italy for 15 years, undefeated in battle, and slowly, agonizingly, it made no difference. He could not take Rome itself. He had no siege train and too few men. He could not force a decisive battle. Carthage, jealous and short-sighted, sent him little reinforcement, and Rome, bleeding but unbroken, simply raised more armies, took his allies back one by one, and waited him out. The greatest general of the ancient world was slowly strangled by a state too stubborn to know it had lost. Rome's answer to Hannibal came, in the end, from a young man who had survived his slaughters. He had fought at the freezing river as a teenager, and at Cannae, where he was one of the few officers to escape the encirclement and rally the survivors. His name was Scipio, and he had watched Hannibal destroy Roman army after Roman army, and instead of being broken by it, he had studied it. He learned Hannibal's methods, and then he used them against him. He was young, brilliant, and unorthodox, and the Senate distrusted him. He was given command in Spain, where the Carthaginians were strongest, and he took it apart, capturing their great Spanish capital in a lightning assault, then beating their armies with maneuvers Hannibal himself would have admired, flanking and enveloping them exactly as Hannibal had done to the Romans. Within a few years, Carthage's Spanish Empire, the base Hannibal's father had built, the source of the silver and the manpower, was gone. And then Scipio proposed something audacious. Hannibal was still in Italy, undefeated, unbeatable in the field. So Scipio said, leave him there. Don't fight him. Instead, invade Africa. Attack Carthage itself. Force them to call him home. The old senators were horrified, but Scipio got his army, and he sailed, and he landed in Africa, and he began to burn his way toward Carthage, and it worked exactly as he said it would. Carthage, in a panic, recalled Hannibal. After 15 years in Italy, undefeated, the greatest general of the age was summoned home to defend his own city, and he went. The two of them met at last on a plain in North Africa called Zama. Hannibal, aging now, with a hastily assembled army and a screen of war elephants, and Scipio, who had spent his whole adult life learning how to beat this one man. They are said to have met and spoken before the battle, the two greatest soldiers of the age, face to face. Hannibal offered terms. Scipio refused. And then Scipio showed what he had learned. When Hannibal loosed his elephants, the terror weapon meant to shatter the Roman line. Scipio had already arranged his men not in the standard solid formation, but in lanes, with corridors left open between the units. The elephants charged, found gaping avenues in front of them, and simply thundered harmlessly through, to be dealt with at the rear. The great charge achieved nothing. Then Scipio's superb Numidian cavalry, allies he had cultivated, the very horsemen who had won Hannibal his victories in Italy, now fighting for Rome, drove Hannibal's cavalry from the field, and then came back and struck the Carthaginian infantry in the rear, exactly as Hannibal's horsemen had done at Cannae. Hannibal was enveloped and destroyed by his own tactic, executed by a man who had survived it. Carthage surrendered. The war was over, and Rome, having beaten the greatest power in the Western world and the greatest general of the age, was now, unquestionably, the master of the Mediterranean. But Rome could not forget the terror. For 50 years afterward, a broken, disarmed, harmless Carthage went on paying its indemnity and quietly growing rich again on trade. And Rome watched and could not sleep. There was one old senator in particular who had fought in the war as a young man and who became obsessed. Every single time he rose to speak in the Senate, on any subject at all, a road, a tax, anything, he would finish his speech with the same sentence. And furthermore, I think Carthage must be destroyed, over and over, for years, until he wore the Senate down. And so Rome manufactured a war. It made demands designed to be impossible. Hand over your weapons, then hand over your ships, then abandon your city entirely and move 10 miles inland, away from the sea. Carthage complied with everything until the last, and then, disarmed and hopeless, decided it would rather die fighting. The city held out for 3 years, its people making weapons from their own hair for bowstrings, fighting street by street when the walls finally broke, in 6 days of the most savage urban fighting the ancient world had seen. And then Rome erased it. The city was burned, the survivors sold into slavery, the site razed. The Roman general who did it, Scipio's own adopted grandson, is said to have wept as he watched Carthage burn, and quoted a line of Homer about the day when sacred Troy would fall, because he had just realized, looking at the flames, that no city lives forever, and that one day this would be Rome. He was right, but that day was still 600 years away. Rome now conquered relentlessly Greece, Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, the whole rim of the sea. And it is worth pausing to understand how, because the Roman army was not simply large or brave. It was a machine, unlike anything the world had produced. What made the legion terrifying was not individual heroism. It was discipline, engineering, and a refusal to stop. A Roman legionary was a professional. He drilled endlessly. The Romans said their drills were bloodless battles, and their battles bloody drills. He carried something like 60 or 70 pounds of gear on the march. Armor, shield, sword, 2 throwing spears, entrenching tools, cooking pot, rations, stakes. Roman soldiers were called Marius mules for a reason, and they marched perhaps 20 miles a day carrying it, day after day after day. And then, at the end of every single day's march, every day, in hostile territory or friendly, whether or not an enemy was anywhere near, the legion stopped early and built a fortified camp. Ditch, rampart, palisade, laid out on the identical plan every time, so that every soldier knew exactly where his tent, the commander's tent, the gates, and the roads were in any camp, anywhere in the empire. Then they slept behind their wall, and in the morning they tore it down and marched 20 more miles and built it again. Enemies could not surprise them. Enemies could not outmarch them. An army that entrenches every night for 1,000 miles cannot be caught. In battle, the legion fought as a body. The men closed up behind their big curved shields, hurled their heavy javelins at close range, weapons designed to bend on impact so they could not be thrown back and would foul an enemy's shield, and then drew short stabbing swords and went in close, shoulder to shoulder, working with brutal economy. Shield punch, short thrust, step forward, and crucially, the legion could rotate its lines mid-battle, fresh men, moving up through gaps to relieve the exhausted front rank, against a barbarian charge, which came in one enormous, screaming, spending everything rush. This was devastating. The Romans absorbed the charge behind their shields, let it exhaust itself, and then advanced over the top with fresh men, methodically, and killed everything in front of them. The discipline that made this possible was ferocious. A soldier who fell asleep on watch was beaten to death by his own comrades. If a whole unit broke and ran in disgrace, the punishment was decimation. The unit was divided into groups of 10, they drew lots, and the 9 killed the one with their bare hands in front of everyone. It is where the word comes from. The Roman army was, in a very real sense, more afraid of its own officers than of any enemy. And they were engineers as much as soldiers. Roman armies bridged rivers, drained marshes, cut roads through forests, and built siege works of terrifying ambition. Besieging a hilltop fortress in the Judean desert, they built an entire ramp up the side of a mountain to roll a tower to the walls. Besieging a Gallic stronghold while a relief army was coming, they built 2 complete rings of fortification, one facing inward to trap the town, one facing outward to hold off the relieving army, miles of walls, towers, ditches, and traps, and then fought and won a battle on both sides at once. When Romans could not beat you, they simply built until they could. And behind the machine stood the thing that had always made Rome dangerous. It could lose and keep coming. Any state can win a battle. Rome's gift was to absorb catastrophe, the burning of the city, the massacre at Cannae, whole fleets sunk, entire armies annihilated, and simply raise another one. The manpower was vast, because Rome kept turning conquered peoples into Romans. The stubbornness was bottomless. For roughly 2 centuries after Hannibal, this machine rolled outward in every direction, and one kingdom after another that had thought itself great. The successors of Alexander in Greece and the East, the tribes of Spain and Gaul, discovered that they were not fighting a nation. They were fighting a system that did not get tired and did not accept that it had lost. And then, having conquered the world, Rome turned that machine on itself. Rome had conquered the world, and it destroyed the Republic. That is the great irony at the heart of this story, and it happened in a way nobody intended and few understood until it was far too late. The wealth that came flooding in from the conquered provinces, the loot, the tribute, the slaves, did not go to the people. It went to the aristocracy, in quantities that had no precedent. Senators became rich beyond anything Roman society had ever known, and they spent that money buying land. And here the poison did its work. The Roman soldier had traditionally been a small farmer, called up for a season's campaign and then returning to his fields. But now the wars lasted years and were fought across the sea. And while a man was away for a decade conquering Greece or Spain, his farm failed. And when he came home, some senator's agent was waiting to buy his ruined land for a pittance and roll it into a vast estate, worked now, not by free Roman farmers, but by the hundreds of thousands of slaves the conquests had produced. So the men who had won the world came home to find they had no land, no work, and no place. They drifted into Rome, into the teeming apartment blocks, and formed a huge, poor, angry, idle urban mass, dependent on cheap grain and the favor of politicians. Rome had conquered everything and hollowed out its own citizens in the process. The first men to try to fix it were 2 brothers, from one of the noblest families in Rome, and their fate set the pattern for everything that followed. The elder, Tiberius Gracchus, was elected tribune of the people, and he proposed something reasonable and modest: enforce the old law limiting how much public land any one man could hold, and redistribute the surplus to landless citizens. It was legal, it was overdue, and it was aimed at the very senators who held that land illegally. They fought him savagely. He fought back, using every procedural weapon he could find, breaking conventions to force it through, and in doing so he frightened them badly, because they saw a popular hero with the mob behind him, ignoring the norms, and they whispered the oldest and deadliest Roman accusation, that he wanted to be king. And so a mob of senators, led by his own cousin, took up clubs and broken furniture and beat Tiberius Gracchus to death in the streets, along with hundreds of his supporters, and threw the bodies in the river. It was the first political bloodshed in Rome in 400 years, and it was a hinge in history. The unspoken rule of the Republic, that Romans settled their differences by law and argument, not murder, had been broken by the Senate itself. And once broken, it could not be repaired. His younger brother Gaius took up the cause a decade later, more radical and more brilliant, and it ended the same way: a declaration of emergency, a massacre of his followers, and Gaius dead, and 3,000 of his supporters executed afterward. The lesson everyone drew was simple and catastrophic: violence works. Then came a change that doomed the Republic completely, and it was made with the best of intentions. Rome faced a crisis, a war in Africa going badly, and a terrifying migration of Germanic tribes threatening Italy itself. And a brilliant, brutal, low-born general named Marius fixed it by throwing out the old rule that soldiers had to be property-owning citizens. Instead, he opened the legions to the landless poor, the very men the land crisis had created, offering them pay, plunder, and crucially, a grant of land when they retired. Militarily, it was a triumph. He created a professional standing army of long-service veterans and smashed the Germanic invasion, saving Italy. But politically, it was a time bomb, because those soldiers now had no farm to go back to. Their entire future, their retirement, their land, their livelihood, depended not on the Senate, which never bothered to guarantee it, but on their general personally delivering it for them. And so the loyalty of Roman armies quietly transferred from the state to whichever general commanded them. Rome had created legions that belonged to men rather than to Rome. Every ambitious politician now had, or could get, a private army of tens of thousands of professional soldiers who would follow him anywhere at all. It took only one man to demonstrate what that meant. His name was Sulla, an aristocrat, a superb general, and a man of glacial ruthlessness. And when the Senate's enemies stripped him of a command he believed was his, he did the unthinkable. He turned his army around and marched on Rome itself. No Roman had ever done it. It was sacrilege beyond words. The army was forbidden even to enter the city under arms. His own officers refused and abandoned him. The soldiers followed anyway. He took Rome by force, killed his enemies, and then left for his war. And when he came back, having won it, he did it again. And this time there was a full civil war, and he won, and made himself dictator, and then showed Rome what was truly coming. He posted lists in the Forum, the proscriptions, names of men declared outlaws, who could be killed by anyone, their property forfeit, a bounty paid for their heads. Thousands died, enemies, yes, but also anyone with a nice estate someone wanted. Sons were disinherited, families ruined. Heads were displayed in the Forum. For months, Rome lived in terror while the killing lists grew. Then Sulla reformed the constitution to strengthen the Senate, resigned his dictatorship, retired to his villa, and died in bed, having proved, beyond any argument, that a Roman with an army could take the Republic whenever he wanted, do as he pleased, and get away with it. Everyone in Rome watched, and two young men in particular took careful notes. One of them was a teenager Sulla had nearly killed, and had been persuaded to spare, remarking, they say, that in that boy he saw many a Marius. His name was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived, and one of the most dangerous. He was a brilliant general, a superb writer, a shrewd politician, a spectacular showman, and a man of boundless, restless ambition who was never, at any point in his life, satisfied. He came from an ancient but faded noble family, and he clawed his way up the political ladder by borrowing money on a scale that beggars belief, buying popularity with games and feasts and public works, running up debts so enormous that his creditors were terrified he would die and take their fortunes with him. He was captured by pirates as a young man, and the story of it tells you everything. When they demanded a ransom, he laughed and told them they were asking far too little for a man of his importance, and made them raise it. He spent his captivity joking with them, writing poems, and telling them cheerfully that once released he would come back and crucify them all. They thought it was charming. He was released, immediately raised a fleet, hunted them down, and crucified them all. He rose through the offices, made alliances with the two most powerful men in Rome, the fabulously rich Crassus and the greatest general of the age, Pompey, and together the three of them carved the Republic up between them. And then Caesar took the command that would make him Gaul. For 9 years, Caesar conquered Gaul, modern France and beyond, in a campaign of staggering brilliance and staggering brutality. He fought Germanic kings, chased tribes across rivers, bridged the Rhine in 10 days just to prove he could, and then dismantled it and came back. He crossed the sea to Britain twice, to the amazement of the Roman public, who could hardly believe there was land out there at all. And the final act was his masterpiece. The Gauls at last united under a young, capable chieftain named Vercingetorix, who understood Caesar's weakness, supply, and burned his own countryside to starve the Romans out. He cornered Caesar's army and nearly broke it. And then he made one mistake and withdrew into a hilltop fortress called Alesia, expecting to hold out until a massive Gallic relief army came. And Caesar built. He threw a ring of fortifications, walls, towers, ditches, sharpened stakes, hidden traps, 11 miles around the entire hill to seal Vercingetorix in. And then, learning a relief army of perhaps 250,000 Gauls was coming, he built a second ring, 13 miles around, facing outward. His army was now sandwiched between two enemies, inside its own double wall. The relief army came, and for days Caesar fought a battle on both sides at once, riding from crisis to crisis in his famous red cloak, and at the decisive moment led a cavalry charge out of the works himself. The relief army broke and fled. The next day Vercingetorix rode out and laid his weapons at Caesar's feet. Gaul was conquered. 1,000,000 people, it was said, killed, another 1,000,000 enslaved. Caesar was now the master of a huge, rich province and a devoted veteran army of the best soldiers in the world, and he was the most famous man in Rome, which meant his enemies had to destroy him. Crassus was dead, killed in a disastrous Eastern war, and Pompey, Caesar's old ally, and his son-in-law had drifted to the Senate side, alarmed by how enormous Caesar had become, and the Senate moved to finish him. Give up your army, come back to Rome as a private citizen, and face prosecution for everything you've done. It meant exile or death. Caesar offered compromise after compromise. They were refused. They wanted him ruined. So on a cold January night, Caesar came to a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon, the legal boundary of his province. To cross it with an army was treason. war against the Roman people. He sat on the bank a long time, they say, and understood exactly what he was about to do. And then he said that the die was cast and crossed. It was Sulla's lesson, applied by a better man. Italy fell to him with astonishing speed. Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece rather than fight him there. And what followed was 4 years of civil war fought across the whole Mediterranean world. Caesar beat Pompey's veteran armies in Spain, then crossed to Greece, and though badly outnumbered and nearly starving, destroyed Pompey's much larger army at Pharsalus. Pompey fled to Egypt, where, as we have seen on another night, a boy king's advisers murdered him on the beach and presented his head to Caesar as a gift, and Caesar wept, and then found himself entangled with a young queen named Cleopatra and a war in Alexandria and a son. He won it all, and then he came home and did something unprecedented. He forgave. Where Sulla had posted killing lists, Caesar pardoned his enemies, publicly, ostentatiously, and repeatedly. Men who had fought against him were not only spared, but given offices. It was genuine, and it was also the smartest possible policy, and it made him beloved. And then he governed like a whirlwind, reforming the hopelessly broken calendar into essentially the one we still use, settling veterans, founding colonies, relieving debt, planning to drain marshes and dig canals, and rebuild Carthage and Corinth. He was brilliant at it, but he was also, by now, plainly and permanently in charge. He was made dictator, and then dictator for 10 years, and finally dictator for life. His face appeared on the coins, a living Roman, on the coinage like a king. Statues went up. He wore triumphal dress constantly, and the word began to circulate, the word that had been poison in Rome for 500 years, since Lucretia died and Brutus swore his oath. King. And so a conspiracy formed of some 60 senators, including men Caesar had personally pardoned, and led, with exquisite historical irony, by a man named Brutus who claimed descent from the very Brutus who had expelled the last king. They convinced themselves they were tyrannicides, liberators, saving the Republic. On the 15th of March, in the year 44 before our era, they surrounded him at a Senate meeting and stabbed him 23 times, and he fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey, the rival he had beaten, and the killers ran out into the forum with bloody daggers, shouting that Rome was free. Rome was not free. Rome was about to endure 13 more years of civil war and come out the other side with an emperor. The murderers had killed the man. The republic they thought they were saving had, in truth, died years earlier, the day Sulla's soldiers followed him across the city boundary, or the day the Senate beat Tiberius Gracchus to death, or the day the legions started belonging to generals instead of Rome. Caesar didn't kill the Republic. He was its autopsy. When Caesar's will was read, Rome discovered that he had adopted, as his son and heir, an 18-year-old grandnephew almost nobody had heard of, a frail, sickly boy named Octavian, who was studying abroad. Mark Antony, Caesar's veteran lieutenant, and everyone else in Rome, wrote him off instantly. A teenager, a nobody. He would be brushed aside within a month. It was the greatest miscalculation in Roman history. That teenager would outmaneuver every single one of them and rule the Roman world for 45 years. He was not a soldier. He was frequently ill and left the fighting to better men. What he had instead was a cold, patient, ruthless political intelligence that has few equals in history. He came to Rome, claimed his inheritance and Caesar's name, and immediately began doing the only thing that mattered, buying the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, who adored the dead man and now transferred that love to the boy who carried his name. Within a year, he had an army. Within 2, the Senate, which had tried to use him against Antony, discovered he had used them instead and forced them to make him consul at 19. Then he did the thing nobody expected. He allied with Antony, the man he had just been fighting, and with a third general, and together they took Rome and hunted down Caesar's killers. And they revived Sulla's proscriptions, the killing lists, and butchered their enemies by the thousand, dividing up the corpses and the property between them. The great orator Cicero, who had spent his life defending the Republic with words, and had savaged Antony in speech after speech, was hunted down and killed, and his head and hands were nailed up in the forum where he had spoken them. The Republic did not end with a noble last stand. It ended with lists and severed heads. Then, inevitably, the victors turned on each other. Antony went east, and as we have seen on another night, fell into the orbit of Cleopatra, and into the dream of an Eastern empire ruled beside her. And Octavian, back in Rome, did what he did better than anyone alive. He made it a story. He cast himself as the defender of Rome, of Italy, of Roman virtue, against a decadent traitor bewitched by a foreign sorceress who meant to rule Rome from Alexandria. He even seized and published Antony's will, real or forged, showing that Antony wished to be buried in Egypt, which horrified the Roman public. And then, cleverly, he declared war not on Antony, a Roman, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen. So it was not a civil war at all. It was Rome against the East. It ended at sea at Actium, where Antony's fleet was outmaneuvered and Cleopatra's squadron fled, and Antony broke off and followed her, and everything collapsed. Both were dead within a year, and Egypt, the last great independent kingdom of the Old World, 3,000 years of pharaohs, became Octavian's personal property. He was, at 32, the sole master of the entire Roman world, with no rival left alive. And here Octavian did the cleverest thing anyone in Roman history ever did. He knew exactly what had killed his adoptive father. Caesar had taken the power and flaunted the title and been stabbed for it. So Octavian took all the power and gave the titles back. In a piece of political theater of breathtaking skill, he came before the Senate and announced that the civil wars were over, that he was laying down all his extraordinary powers, and that he was restoring the Republic to the Senate and the people of Rome. And the Senate, packed with his supporters, terrified of him and desperate for peace, begged him to take it back. So, reluctantly, as a public service, he accepted a few modest offices and a new honorific name, Augustus, the revered one. And that was the trick. On paper, the Republic was restored. The Senate met. Consuls were elected. The old forms all continued, scrupulously observed. Augustus called himself merely the first citizen, princeps, just a senator among senators, first in honor, nothing more. In reality, he controlled every province that had legions in it, which meant he controlled the entire army. He controlled the grain supply, which meant he controlled Rome's stomach. He held the tribune's sacred power, which made his person inviolable and gave him a veto over everything. And he had all the money in the world. He had the substance of absolute monarchy dressed in the costume of the old republic, and he was scrupulously modest about it, living in a famously plain house, dressing simply, addressing the Senate respectfully for over 40 years. Everyone knew. Nobody said so, and it worked so perfectly that the Roman world accepted a monarchy while insisting it was still a republic, and Augustus died in his bed, of old age, after ruling longer than almost any Roman ever had. His last words, reportedly, asked whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and if so, to applaud as he left the stage. And what he built lasted. Augustus ended a century of civil war and gave the Mediterranean world something it had not had in living memory. Peace. The Roman peace, a span of roughly 2 centuries in which the whole vast empire, from Britain to Syria, was largely free of major war within its borders, in which trade flowed, cities grew, roads and aqueducts and theaters went up everywhere, and a merchant could travel from the Atlantic to the Euphrates under one law, one currency, and one guarantee of safety. He found Rome a city of brick, he boasted, and left it a city of marble. He rebuilt it magnificently. He reformed the taxes, professionalized the army, established a fire brigade and a police force, fixed the roads, patronized the greatest literature Rome ever produced. The cost was liberty. The Senate became a debating club that could be ignored. Elections became theater. Free political speech quietly died. Romans traded their republic for peace and order and prosperity. And after 100 years of massacre, proscription, and civil war, the overwhelming majority thought it was a bargain worth making. The Republic was over. The Empire had begun, and its first 2 centuries would be the most prosperous and peaceful the Western world would know for a very long time. But it carried a fatal flaw at its very heart, which Augustus never solved, and which would poison Rome for the next 400 years. He had created a monarchy without ever admitting it was one, which meant there were no rules for the succession. No law said, who got the empire when the emperor died? That question would be answered, again and again, with knives and armies. The flaw showed up immediately. Augustus's own family, the dynasty he founded, produced, within 50 years, some of the most notorious rulers in the history of the world, and demonstrated the terrible truth of absolute power. That when one man can do anything, everything depends on what kind of man he happens to be. His successor was a capable, bitter, deeply reluctant man named Tiberius, a fine general who never wanted the job, who grew steadily more paranoid, and who eventually simply left, retiring to a villa on the island of Capri and ruling the empire by letter for the last decade of his life, while a scheming commander of the imperial guard terrorized Rome in his name and executed his enemies wholesale. The Romans told lurid stories about what went on in that island villa. Whether true or not, the point was made. The empire could be run from a rock in the sea by a recluse, and no one could do anything about it. Then came Caligula, and Rome discovered what a genuinely unhinged, absolute ruler looked like. He began popularly enough, young, the beloved son of a beloved general, greeted with joy after Tiberius's grim final years. And then, some months in, he fell seriously ill, and when he recovered, something in him had changed. Or perhaps it had always been there, and the power simply let it out. He declared himself a living god, and had a temple built to himself, and made senators worship him. He appeared in public dressed as various deities. He is said to have talked to the moon and invited it into his bed. He humiliated the Senate relentlessly, forcing the most dignified men in Rome to run alongside his chariot in their robes, or to wait on him at dinner like slaves. He executed people casually, for amusement, for their property, for a joke. He is supposed to have wished that the Roman people had a single neck, so he could cut it through with one stroke. He bankrupted the treasury on absurd luxuries, building a temporary bridge of boats across a whole bay, 2 miles wide, simply so that he could ride a horse across the sea in defiance of a prophecy that he had as much chance of becoming emperor as of riding a horse across that bay. And he adored his racehorse, gave it a marble stable and an ivory manger, jeweled collars and its own servants, invited it to dinner, and announced he would make it a consul, one of the highest offices in the state. Whether he was insane or simply demonstrating, with vicious wit, that he held the Senate in such contempt that his horse could do their job, it hardly mattered. The message was the same. There were no limits. There was nothing anyone could do. Until, after 4 years, his own guard officers, men he had personally taunted and humiliated, cornered him in a passage and stabbed him to death, along with his wife and small daughter. And the Praetorian Guard, hunting through the palace afterward, found his terrified uncle hiding behind a curtain, dragged him out, and made him emperor on the spot. That was Claudius. Limping, stammering, dismissed his whole life as a fool by his own family. And as it turned out, a genuinely capable ruler who conquered Britain, built harbours and aqueducts, reformed the law, and governed well for 13 years before being poisoned, most said, by his own wife to clear the way for her son. And her son was Nero, whose story we have followed on another night, so we will pass through it lightly here. He began under good guidance and ruled reasonably for 5 years. Then he murdered his own mother. After an attempt to drown her in a collapsing boat failed and she swam ashore, he simply sent soldiers to finish it. He killed his wife. He forced his old tutor, the philosopher Seneca, to open his veins. He performed on stage as a singer and locked the theatre doors so nobody could escape his recitals, while informers noted who looked insufficiently thrilled. And when the great fire burned much of Rome, the rumor spread that he had sung about the fall of Troy while watching it burn, and needing a scapegoat for the whispers that he had set it himself to clear ground for his enormous new palace. He blamed the Christians and had them tortured to death as public entertainment, burning some alive as torches in his gardens. He ended abandoned by everyone, running from the soldiers sent to arrest him, and died by his own hand, weeping that the world was losing a great artist. And with him died Augustus's line, and Rome learned exactly what the unsolved succession problem meant. The empire tore itself apart. In a single year, 4 different men were proclaimed emperor. The first, an elderly general, was murdered by the Praetorian Guard in the Forum after refusing to pay them a bribe. The second killed himself when his army was beaten. The third, a glutton with no talent for anything, was dragged through the streets, tortured, killed, and thrown in the river. The fourth was a tough, plain-spoken general named Vespasian, who founded a new dynasty and restored order. But the secret was out, and it was the most dangerous secret in the empire's history. As one historian put it, it had been revealed that an emperor could be made somewhere other than Rome, that the throne belonged to whoever had the biggest army and the will to use it. For the next 400 years, that lesson would return again and again to tear the empire apart, whenever the legions decided they liked their own general better than the man in the palace. Vespasian, the plain soldier who ended the chaos, understood something important. Nero had built a vast private pleasure palace on land cleared by the Great Fire, in the middle of Rome, with an artificial lake at its center, the ultimate symbol of an emperor taking the city for himself. So Vespasian drained the lake, and on that very spot, on the ground Nero had stolen for his private paradise, he built something and gave it to the people. The Colosseum, an arena seating perhaps 50,000, 4 stories of arches and marble, with a system of numbered tickets and stairways so efficient that the whole crowd could enter or leave in minutes. A design that stadium architects still study. Beneath the floor was a warren of tunnels, cells, and lifts that could raise animals and scenery straight up into the arena as if by magic. It could even, it was said, be flooded for mock sea battles. It was a masterpiece, and it was propaganda of the highest order. Where the tyrant took, the new dynasty gives. The land that had been one man's lake was now the people's amphitheater. And what happened inside it is one of the hardest things to reconcile about Rome. A civilization of law and engineering and philosophy that also made industrialized killing into a national entertainment. The games were free, paid for by emperors and rich men buying popularity, and they ran for days. Mornings were beast hunts. Exotic animals shipped from across the empire, lions, leopards, bears, elephants, rhinos, hippos, hunted and slaughtered in the arena in enormous numbers. Some species were driven to local extinction to feed the demand. Middays were executions. Criminals, deserters, and prisoners killed in inventive and horrifying ways, sometimes staged as scenes from mythology for the amusement of the lunch crowd. and the afternoons were the gladiators, and they were not what the popular image suggests. They were expensive. A trained gladiator represented years of investment by his owner, and you did not throw that away casually. Most fights did not end in death, and a good gladiator might fight a dozen times or more and win his freedom. They were slaves and condemned men and prisoners of war, but also, sometimes, free volunteers who signed up for the money and the fame. And fame there was. Gladiators were celebrities, their names scratched on walls, their images on lamps and cups, adored by crowds and notoriously by aristocratic women. A poet, watching his fellow Romans, said something that has outlived everything else he wrote, that the people who had once bestowed commands and legions and everything else now bothered themselves about nothing, and longed for only two things: bread and circuses, free grain and free games, a citizenry that had traded its political power for entertainment and a full stomach. He meant it as an insult, and it has never stopped being quoted because it has never stopped being recognizable. And then, for most of a century, Rome got extraordinarily lucky and stumbled onto a solution to the succession problem, almost by accident. A run of 5 emperors, one after another, turned out to be genuinely capable, decent, hard-working rulers. And the reason was simple. None of them had a son. So each, instead of handing the empire to a child by blood, chose the best man he could find, adopted him formally as his heir, and trained him for the job. Merit, not birth. It was the closest Rome ever came to solving the fatal flaw at the empire's heart, and it produced the best century of government the ancient world ever saw. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent, from Britain and the Atlantic across to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube to the Sahara. Perhaps 60 or 70 million people, a fifth of the human race, under one government, one law, one currency. Trajan was a soldier and a builder, conquering Dacia, and using its gold to fund a colossal building program at home. Under Hadrian came consolidation. He was a restless, brilliant, difficult man who spent most of his reign traveling the provinces personally, inspecting, reforming, building, and who understood, unlike Trajan, that the empire had reached its limits. He gave up the eastern conquests and drew borders, and in the north of Britain he built a wall clean across the island, 73 miles from sea to sea, with forts and gates and garrisons, and stood there at the very edge of the known world and said, "This far and no further." The wall still stands. And the last of them was Marcus Aurelius, who is the strangest figure in the whole imperial story. He was a philosopher, a genuine, serious Stoic thinker, who never wanted power, and who spent almost his entire reign fighting. Plague sweeping through the empire and killing millions, and endless grinding war on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes pressing south. And through all of it, in his tent at night, on campaign, he wrote private notes to himself, for no eyes but his own, reminding himself to be humble, to be patient, to do his duty, to remember that he would die and be forgotten, and that none of the glory mattered. Those notes survived, and they are read today, 18 centuries later, by people who have no idea Rome ever existed, the private diary of the most powerful man in the world, telling himself to be good. It is the high point of the story. The empire at its greatest extent, governed by a philosopher king, at peace and prosperous, its cities gleaming, its roads and aqueducts running. And then Marcus Aurelius, the man who had been chosen for merit by a chain of emperors who chose for merit, did the one thing none of his predecessors had done. He had a son, and he gave the empire to him. His name was Commodus, and he was a vain, brutal narcissist who neglected the government, renamed Rome after himself, dressed as Hercules, and fought in the arena as a gladiator against opponents who dared not hurt him, until he was strangled in his bath by his own wrestling partner. The golden century was over. And what came next nearly destroyed everything. Everyone remembers the Colosseum. But if you had asked a Roman what he truly cared about, what he argued about in the baths and bet his wages on and rioted over, he would not have said the gladiators. He would have said the races. The Circus Maximus was the largest building for public entertainment ever constructed in human history, and nothing since has come close. It could hold, the estimates vary, but plausibly, 250,000 people. 250,000. Modern stadiums hold 80 or 100,000, and we think them enormous. Rome had a venue for a quarter of its entire population, packed into a valley between two hills, and on race days it filled. And what happened? There was chariot racing. 7 laps around a long central spine, 4 to 12 chariots, drivers with the reins wrapped around their bodies for leverage, which meant that when you crashed, and you were dragged behind your own horses until you could cut yourself free with the knife every driver carried at his waist, or until you died. They called a crash a shipwreck. The turns at each end were where the wrecks happened, and the crowd came for exactly that. But the astonishing part was the factions. Every driver raced for one of 4 teams: the Reds, the Whites, the Greens, and the Blues. And Romans supported these teams with an intensity that makes modern sports fandom look mild. You inherited your color from your father. You wore it. You cursed the opposition. Emperors were partisans. One was a fanatical green who dined in the stables, and when a favorite horse of that faction died, put it in mourning. People scratched curses onto lead tablets and buried them in the racetrack, calling on demons to break the legs of the Blues horses and the necks of their drivers. Actual curse tablets, hundreds of them, dug up by archaeologists. And the fans were violent. Riots over race results were routine. The worst of them, centuries later in Constantinople, began at the Hippodrome when the Blues and Greens, for once united, turned on the emperor, and it exploded into a full-scale insurrection that burned down half the capital, killed something like 30,000 people, and nearly toppled Justinian, who was packing to flee before his wife told him that purple made a fine burial shroud and shamed him into staying. A sports riot nearly ended the Roman Empire. The greatest drivers were the highest-paid athletes in human history, genuinely, by any adjusted measure. One of them, a Spaniard, won nearly 1,500 races over a 24-year career, and retired with winnings that have been estimated, in modern terms, in the billions. He started as a slave. He died rich and famous, with a monument raised by his fellow drivers listing every victory. There has never been a professional athlete, before or since, who earned a larger share of his society's wealth. That was Rome's real passion. Not the philosophy, not the law, not even the blood of the arena. 4 colors, 7 laps, 250,000 people screaming in a valley, and a boy born a slave becoming the richest man in the world by driving very fast around a corner without dying. Before we follow Rome down into its long fall, let us drift a while through the thing the Romans did better than anyone in the ancient world. Better, in some respects, than anyone would do again for 1,000 years and more. They built. Start with the roads, because they are the skeleton of the whole empire. The Romans built something on the order of 50,000 miles of paved highway, enough to circle the earth twice, reaching from the Scottish border to the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates. And they were built to last. A deep trench, then a foundation of large stones, then layers of gravel and sand and concrete, then a surface of tightly fitted paving blocks, cambered so the rain ran off into ditches on either side. Some of them are still there. Some are still in use. They ran straight, famously, obsessively straight, driving through hills rather than around them, on bridges over valleys, because a Roman road existed to move a legion from one place to another as fast as physically possible, and a straight line is the shortest distance. The consequences were enormous. and mostly unintended. An empire with roads like that could move armies fast enough to hold frontiers thousands of miles apart. But it could also move merchants and letters and ideas and grain and tax collectors and eventually missionaries. The roads made the empire a single connected organism. When Rome fell, they became the arteries of medieval Europe, and much of the continent's road network still follows the lines Roman surveyors drew 2 millennia ago. And then the aqueducts, which may be the most beautiful thing Rome ever did. A big city needs water, enormous quantities of it, and Rome solved that problem on a scale nobody would attempt again until the 19th century. Roman engineers found springs and lakes in the hills, sometimes 50 or 60 miles away, and then built channels to bring the water to the city, running downhill the entire distance on a gradient so shallow, sometimes just a foot of drop per mile, that it beggars belief they could survey it at all, with nothing but sighting instruments and water levels and patience. The channels ran underground where they could, and where a valley intervened, they marched across it on those famous tiers of arches, stone upon stone, sometimes 150 feet in the air. Rome had 11 of them, delivering, by some estimates, enough water for every inhabitant to have hundreds of gallons a day, more per person than many modern cities. And it never stopped. It ran day and night forever, by gravity alone. No pumps, no power, feeding the fountains where the poor drew their water, the great public baths, the private homes of the rich, and the sewers that flushed the waste away. And there were aqueducts like it in cities all over the empire, in Spain, in Gaul, in North Africa. Some of them still stand, and one or two still carry water. The secret weapon behind much of it was a material. The Romans invented a concrete made with volcanic ash that was extraordinary. It could set underwater, which let them build harbors and bridge piers where nobody had built before. It was cheap, it could be poured into any shape, and it let them do the thing that defines Roman architecture: the arch, the vault, and above all the dome. Their masterpiece still stands, whole, in Rome, a temple to all the gods, the Pantheon, built under Hadrian. Its dome is a single, unreinforced concrete shell, 142 feet across, with a great round opening at its center, open to the sky, so that a shaft of sunlight moves across the interior all day like the finger of a god, and rain falls through onto the floor and drains away through holes cut for it. It has stood, intact, for 19 centuries. It remained the largest dome in the world for about 1,300 years, and it is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. Nobody in the Middle Ages could work out how to do it. The recipe was lost when Rome fell, and it took until modern times to properly understand what they had done. And the strangest part, their concrete gets stronger with age. Seawater, which destroys modern concrete, reacts with the volcanic ash in Roman harbor concrete to grow new interlocking crystals inside it. 2,000 years of waves have made those Roman piers tougher than the day they were poured. That is the thing to hold onto about Roman building. They built as though it would last forever, because they could not imagine that Rome would not last forever. The roads, the aqueducts, the bridges still carrying traffic, the theaters still hosting concerts, the walls, the harbors, the sewers of Rome that ran for 1,000 years and in places still function. They over-engineered everything. They built for eternity. And then the empire that built it all came apart, and for centuries afterward, people lived among these things, walking on roads they could not have made, drinking from aqueducts they could not have built, staring up at domes they could not explain, and told each other that giants must have done it, or demons, because it was inconceivable that ordinary men had once possessed such skill and then lost it. But ordinary men had, and then they lost it. That is what a fall actually looks like. Step back in the middle years of the empire and look at what Rome had actually made. because for about 200 years, something existed that had never existed before and would not exist again for a very long time. From the rain-soaked wall in northern Britain to the baking edge of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates in Iraq, perhaps 60 or 70 million people, a fifth of the human race, lived under one government, one law, one currency, and one guarantee that no army would come. Think about what that meant in practice. A merchant could load a ship in Alexandria and sell in London without crossing a single border, changing money once, or paying a customs duty at every river. A letter could go from Syria to Spain, along paved roads with a way station every dozen miles. A man from Africa could become emperor, and did. A Spaniard could command the legions, and did. Greek doctors practiced in Britain. Syrian merchants settled in Gaul. British wool and Egyptian grain and Spanish oil and Indian pepper and Chinese silk all flowed through the same markets. There is Roman glass in Japan and Roman coins in India, and a Roman embassy apparently reached the court of China. And everywhere the empire went, it built the same things, so that a Roman could step off a ship in a city he had never seen in Africa, in Turkey, in Provence, and find it instantly familiar. A forum, a basilica, a temple, a theatre, an amphitheatre, an aqueduct, public baths, a grid of paved streets, and the same language on the inscriptions. The ruins of those cities are scattered across 3 continents today, and they all look like each other. Rome exported a template of civilization and stamped it onto the world. Was it good? For millions, no, it was conquest, slavery, extortionate taxes, and the arena. Rome took what it wanted, and its provinces paid for the marble. A British chieftain, in a speech a Roman historian put in his mouth and clearly half believed himself, said the truest thing anyone ever said about the empire, that the Romans made a desert and called it peace. But it is also true that ordinary people in those provinces, within a generation or two, mostly stopped thinking of themselves as conquered and started thinking of themselves as Roman, because Rome let them. It gave them citizenship, careers, roads, courts, and the chance for their grandsons to sit in the Senate. Almost no empire in history has done that. Most conquerors rule over the conquered forever. Rome, at its best, dissolved the difference. And when it all came apart, that is what people missed. Not the emperors, the ordinariness of it, that you could travel and trade, and expect the water to run and the courts to sit and the roads to be safe. For centuries afterward, in a Europe of small kingdoms and bad roads and no safety, people looked back at that lost world of connectedness and ordered the way we might look at a golden age. And they were not entirely wrong. Let us drift, for a while, into the life of an ordinary man in the machine, because the empire was held together, for centuries, by a few 100,000 of them standing on cold frontiers a very long way from home. A Roman legionary signed up for 25 years. 25. He joined as a young man, and if he survived, and a fair number did, he came out in his 40s with a lump sum or a plot of land and Roman citizenship if he had not been born with it. That was the bargain. Give the empire your entire adult life, and it will make you a Roman and set you up at the end. And most of that life was not battle. Battle was rare. Most of it was work. Roman soldiers built the roads, the bridges, the forts, the walls. They quarried stone, made bricks, cut timber, dug ditches, and drilled endlessly. They were, functionally, an enormous corps of armed engineers who occasionally fought. On the northern frontier, in Britain, wooden writing tablets survive from a fort near Hadrian's Wall, actual letters, in the actual handwriting of actual people, preserved in the mud for 19 centuries. And what they talk about is not glory. They talk about socks, underpants. Somebody's sent a care package. Socks, 2 pairs of sandals, underwear, because the north of Britain is freezing, and the letters say so. There is a birthday party invitation from one officer's wife to another, the earliest known writing in Latin by a woman asking her to come, saying how much she wants to see her. There are complaints about the roads and requests for more beer, and a note dismissing the local Britons as useless in a fight. That is the empire, really, not the marble and the eagles. A man on a wall at the edge of the world, in the rain, waiting for his socks. Around every permanent fort, a town grew. Soldiers were technically forbidden to marry for much of the empire's history, and did anyway, taking local women as unofficial wives, fathering children who grew up beside the fort, and marrying them properly when they were discharged. So the frontier filled with settlements, taverns, workshops, temples, brothels, bathhouses, because even on the freezing edge of Britain, the army built proper heated baths, since a Roman was not going to give up his bath merely because he was at the end of the earth. And the men in those forts were increasingly not Italians at all. The legions recruited from everywhere: Spaniards, Gauls, Africans, Syrians, Britons, Germans. A soldier from Syria might spend his life on the Scottish border. A Briton might end up on the Danube. They worshipped their own gods alongside Rome's, married local women, and their sons joined up in turn. Over centuries, this quietly did something extraordinary. It made Roman a thing you could become anywhere, regardless of where you were born or what your ancestors were. Eventually, an emperor simply granted citizenship to nearly every free person in the empire at a stroke, and the thing was complete. Rome, which had begun as one city that murdered its neighbors, ended by handing its name to 60 million people from Scotland to the Sahara. That was Rome's real genius, and it is why it lasted. Not the legions, the citizenship. Rome's roads and aqueducts are the visible legacy, but the deepest one is invisible, and you probably live inside it without ever thinking about it. Rome gave the world its law. The Romans were, above everything, a legal people. They were obsessed with rules, procedures, contracts, precedents, and the exact wording of things. And over a millennium, they built up an enormous body of law, statutes, edicts, the opinions of great jurists, worked out case by case with a lawyer's precision. And near the end, the Eastern Emperor Justinian had the whole vast, contradictory mess gathered up, sorted, and codified into a single organized body of law, and that codification became one of the most influential books ever produced. Because when the Western Empire fell and the law schools closed and the legions went home, the law survived on parchment, and centuries later, medieval Europe rediscovered it and studied it and built its own legal systems on top of it. The legal codes of most of continental Europe, of Latin America, of much of Africa and Asia, descend from Roman law. Even in the English-speaking common law world, the vocabulary and the concepts are Roman to the bone. And it is not just the technicalities. Some of the ideas are Roman inventions or Roman refinements that we now treat as simply obvious. That a person is innocent until proven guilty. That the burden of proof falls on the accuser, not the accused. That there should be a right to a defense. That contracts bind. That property is a defined and protected thing. That a law must be published so people can know it. Every time you hear those principles invoked in a courtroom anywhere on earth, you are hearing Rome. But it is important not to romanticize them, and the honest reckoning is this. The whole magnificent structure rested on slavery, on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. Perhaps a fifth or more of the population of Italy was enslaved. Millions of human beings, prisoners of war, victims of piracy and raids, the children of slaves, exposed infants picked up off rubbish heaps, owned as property, with no rights whatsoever, working the great estates that fed Rome, the mines that killed them within a few years, the households of the rich, the mills, the ships, the brothels, the arena. Every conquest sent tens or hundreds of thousands more into the markets. The wealth that built the marble and the aqueducts was very substantially wrung out of them. A slave was legally a thing. Their owner could beat, brand, rape, or kill them with little consequence. If a master was murdered in his home, the law permitted the execution of every single slave in his household, guilty or not, to encourage vigilance. And Rome actually did this on occasion to hundreds of people at a time. And the great slave revolts were drowned in blood. When Spartacus, a gladiator who broke out with a handful of men and raised an army of tens of thousands of the enslaved, and beat Roman army after Roman army for 2 years, was finally defeated. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome, one every few dozen yards for 130 miles, and left hanging there as a lesson. Roman society was also brutally hierarchical, and by our standards, deeply unjust in ways that had nothing to do with slavery. Women had no political rights, could not vote or hold office, and were legally under the authority of a father or husband their whole lives. Though in practice, Roman women, especially wealthy ones, exercised real influence, ran businesses and estates, and shaped politics through their families in ways the law never acknowledged. So we should hold both truths at once as we drift through this story. Rome gave us law and citizenship, and the idea that power should be limited and accountable. And Rome was also a slave state built on conquest that made mass killing into an afternoon's entertainment. It was not a good society. It was an extraordinary one. Those are different things, and the honest way to look at the past is to see both. Somewhere in the reign of Augustus's successor, in a small, troublesome province at the eastern edge of the empire, a Roman governor executed a Jewish preacher by crucifixion, a routine provincial death sentence, one of thousands, administered to a man his own people had denounced. It was so unimportant that Roman writers barely noticed it for decades. 300 years later, that executed man's followers had taken the empire. How it happened is one of the strangest stories in history, and it is worth drifting through, because nothing else Rome did has shaped the world more. At first, the Christians were a tiny, obscure sect, a splinter of Judaism, spreading quietly along the empire's own roads and shipping lanes, through its cities, in its common Greek, carried by traveling preachers to the ports and markets and slums. Rome's peace and Rome's roads and Rome's shared language made the empire the most efficient machine imaginable for spreading an idea, and this idea traveled. And it was an idea with unusual power in that world. Roman religion was a contract, do the ritual, get the result, and it offered nothing whatever to the poor, the enslaved, the sick, or the grieving. It made no promises about death. It had no comfort in it. Christianity had all of that. A God who suffered, who cared about you personally, who loved the poor and the outcast specifically, who promised that death was not the end and that the last would be first. To a slave, to a woman, to a laborer in a stinking apartment block, that was not a small offer. It was everything the state religion had never even thought to give. And the Christians did something the pagans found genuinely bewildering. They looked after each other. They fed their poor, buried their dead, ransomed their captives, and most remarkably, during the terrible plagues that swept the empire, when families abandoned the sick in the streets to die alone, the Christians stayed and nursed them, their own and other people's. A significant number of them caught it and died doing it. And people noticed. Even a later emperor who despised them and tried to revive the old gods complained bitterly that the Christians cared not only for their own poor but for everyone's, and that this shameful fact was winning them the world. Rome persecuted them on and off for 3 centuries, not for what they believed mostly, but for what they refused to do. Rome was easygoing about gods. It had absorbed hundreds of them. What it could not tolerate was the refusal to make the small public sacrifice to the emperor's genius and the gods of the state, because that sacrifice was not really about religion. It was about loyalty, and about maintaining the contract that kept the gods on Rome's side. A person who would not do it was, in Roman eyes, a traitor endangering everyone. So they were killed under Nero as scapegoats for the fire, burned as living torches in his gardens. Later, systematically in the great persecutions, thrown to beasts in the arena, executed in the provinces, their books burned and their churches demolished. And the persecutions, over and over, failed. They failed because a religion that promises that death is a doorway is very hard to frighten, and because dying well in front of a crowd turns out to be extraordinarily persuasive. Onlookers watched people go calmly, even joyfully, to horrible deaths for this faith, and some of them came away wanting to know what it was that made such a thing possible. The blood of the martyrs, one of them wrote, is seed. By the time Constantine saw his sign in the sky, Christians may have been a tenth of the empire, a minority, but an organized, disciplined, growing one with its own hierarchy and communications running along every Roman road. And then the emperor himself joined, and the money and the patronage and the power came with him. And within a century, the old temples were closed, and the gods that Rome had honored for 1,000 years were finished. It is a genuinely astonishing reversal. An empire that crucified a provincial preacher, and then, 300 years later, put his cross on its battle standards and carried it to the ends of the earth. And when the Western Empire finally dissolved, it was the Church, with its Roman structure, its Latin, its bishops in the old provincial capitals, that survived the wreck and carried Rome's shape and Rome's language forward through the centuries of darkness. The empire died. Its church inherited the world. After Commodus was strangled in his bath, the empire began a slow, wobbling descent. And then, in the middle of the 3rd century, it very nearly disintegrated entirely, in a 50-year catastrophe that came within a hair of ending Roman history a full 2 centuries early. It started with the same old flaw. There were no rules for the succession, and the legions had learned they could make emperors. So they made them. Over roughly 50 years, Rome had something like 26 emperors, and that is only counting the ones generally recognized. There were dozens more claimants proclaimed by one army or another. Almost all of them were murdered, usually by their own soldiers or their own guards, often within months. One was killed after a few weeks. One was captured alive by the Persians, and the stories say, used as a human footstool by the Persian king when he mounted his horse, and then flayed after death, and his skin hung in a temple. That was the emperor of Rome. Each usurper had to buy his soldiers' loyalty, so the money ran out, and so the emperors debased the coinage, mixing more and more base metal into the silver until the coins were essentially worthless slugs with a wash of silver on top. And the result was the ancient world's great inflation. Prices exploded, the currency collapsed, trade shriveled, people reverted to barter, and cities began to shrink. At the same time, the frontiers broke. Germanic confederations poured across the Rhine and Danube and raided deep into Gaul, Spain, Italy itself. In the east, a resurgent Persian empire smashed Roman armies and sacked the great cities of Syria. Plague swept the empire again, killing enormous numbers. Cities across the empire, cities that had stood unwalled for 200 years, in the perfect confidence of the Roman peace, now hastily threw up walls, often built from the rubble of their own tombs and temples and theaters, because the peace was over and the enemy was inside. And then the empire simply broke into 3. Gaul, Britain, and Spain split off under their own line of emperors. The East broke away under the rule of a remarkable warrior queen from the desert city of Palmyra, who took Syria, Anatolia, and Egypt. For about 15 years, There was no single Roman Empire at all, just three fragments at war. That Rome survived at all is astonishing, and it happened because of a run of tough, ruthless soldier emperors from the Balkans, men from the frontier provinces, professional and merciless, who put it back together by sheer violence and will. They beat back the Germans, crushed the Persians, reconquered the breakaway West, and destroyed Palmyra. One of them built a great new wall around Rome itself, the Eternal City, which had not needed walls in centuries, now hiding behind 12 miles of them, which tells you everything about how the world had changed. But the empire they saved was not the empire that had gone into the crisis. It came out militarized, impoverished, and afraid. The old civilian aristocracy was pushed aside by soldiers. The economy never fully recovered, and the tax burden required to pay for the enormous army became crushing. So crushing that emperors eventually froze people into their professions by law, binding farmers to their land and sons to their fathers' trades, because the state could not afford to let anyone escape the tax rolls. The free citizen of the old republic had become, by degrees, a serf. And then came a man who fixed it by making it something else entirely. Diocletian was a soldier's soldier from the Balkans, and he looked at the mess and concluded that the empire was simply too big for one man to defend and too tempting for ambitious generals to leave alone. So he split it. He appointed a co-emperor to rule the West while he ruled the East, and then gave each of them a deputy and designated successor. 4 rulers, each with a region and an army, all in theory cooperating, with a built-in succession plan. It was the first serious attempt to solve the flaw Augustus had left, and for a while it worked brilliantly. He also finished the transformation of the emperor from first citizen into something else. Augustus had pretended to be a modest senator. Diocletian dressed in jewels and silk, wore a diadem, and required those admitted to his presence to prostrate themselves on the floor and kiss the hem of his robe. The old pretense was dead. The emperor was now an oriental god-king, remote and sacred, surrounded by ceremony. And he launched the last and worst persecution of the Christians, who had grown into a substantial minority and whose refusal to sacrifice to the emperor's genius he saw as a treasonous rot in the state's relationship with the gods. Then he did the one thing no Roman emperor had ever done. He retired. Voluntarily. Went home to his enormous palace on the Adriatic coast and grew vegetables. And when the men who came after him begged him to return and sort out the mess they had made, he told them that if they could see the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would never ask him to trade that for power again. His system collapsed almost the moment he left it. The 4 rulers went to war with each other, and the winner would change the world more profoundly than any emperor since Augustus. The winner of the wars that followed Diocletian's retirement was a general's son named Constantine, and on the eve of the battle that would give him Rome, something happened that redirected the history of the Western world. He was marching on Rome against a rival badly outnumbered, and by the account he gave afterward, he saw a sign in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, with words telling him that by this sign he would conquer, and he dreamed that night that he should mark his soldiers' shields with the symbol of the Christians. He did, and the next day, at a bridge over the Tiber just outside Rome, he destroyed his rival's much larger army and drove it into the river and became master of the West. Whether he saw anything, whether he believed it, whether it was a political calculation or a genuine conversion or something tangled in between, historians have argued for centuries and will keep arguing. What is certain is what he did with it. Constantine legalized Christianity, ending 3 centuries in which it had been an illegal, periodically persecuted sect of a few percent of the population. He funded it lavishly, built great churches, granted its clergy privileges and exemptions, and gave it the patronage of the most powerful man on earth. When the young religion tore itself apart over a doctrinal dispute, he summoned its bishops from across the empire to a council and made them hammer out a single agreed statement of belief, a creed still recited, word for word, in churches every Sunday, 17 centuries later. He did not make Christianity the official religion. That came later, under a successor, who banned the old worship outright and closed the temples that had stood for 1,000 years. But Constantine was the hinge. A tiny, persecuted sect became, within a single lifetime, the faith of the empire, and therefore, in time, the faith of Europe, and through Europe, of half the world. It is difficult to name a single decision, by a single human being, that has more thoroughly shaped everything that came after. And then Constantine did the second thing that reshaped the world. He moved the capital. He looked at the map with a soldier's eye and saw what was obvious, that Rome was in the wrong place. The wealth of the empire was in the east. The dangerous frontiers were the Danube and the Persian border. Rome sat off in Italy, sentimental and expensive and strategically useless. So he chose a small Greek town on the strait between Europe and Asia, sitting on one of the most perfect defensive positions on earth. A peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water, commanding the passage between 2 seas, and he rebuilt it as a new imperial capital and named it after himself, Constantinople. It was Rome's greatest strategic decision, and it saved the eastern half of the empire for another millennia. It also quietly doomed the West, because from now on the money, the attention, and the best troops flowed east to the rich half, while the poorer, more exposed West was left to fend for itself with less and less. The empire was formally and permanently divided a few decades later, East and West, 2 emperors, 2 courts, drifting apart in language and interest. The East spoke Greek and grew richer. The West spoke Latin and grew weaker. And the pressure on that weakening West was about to become unbearable. The end of the Western Empire is usually told as a story of barbarian hordes smashing through the gates. The truth is stranger, sadder, and more human than that. The Germanic peoples beyond the frontier were not, mostly, ravening invaders who wanted to destroy Rome. Many of them wanted in. They had spent centuries trading with the empire, serving in its armies, admiring it, adopting its ways and its faith. What they wanted was land inside it, and safety, and a share. And then something drove them. Far to the east, out of the steppe, came the Huns, nomadic horse archers of terrifying mobility and violence, unlike anything the Germanic peoples had faced, and they began smashing and displacing the tribes in their path. And those tribes, fleeing, came to the Danube and begged Rome to let them cross. Rome let them in, a whole people, the Goths, tens of thousands of desperate refugees, and then treated them abominably. Corrupt officials starved them, cheated them, and sold them dogs to eat at the price of a child sold into slavery. The Goths, driven past endurance, revolted, and at a place called Adrianople, they met an Eastern Roman army and destroyed it utterly. The emperor himself was killed, and 2/3 of the army with him, one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and this time the manpower to replace it did not exist. That was the beginning. From then on, the Western Empire was less a state than a negotiation. Whole peoples moved inside the borders, were settled as allies on Roman land, were hired to fight other barbarians, and increasingly ran things themselves. The Western Roman army became, in the end, mostly Germanic. The men defending Rome were the same kinds of men attacking it. And then, in the year 410, the Goths, under a leader who had served Rome, who wanted a Roman title and land for his people, and had been refused and cheated one time too many, marched on Rome itself and sacked it. Militarily, it hardly mattered. Rome had not been the capital for a century. The emperor was safe behind the marshes at Ravenna. The sack lasted 3 days and was, by ancient standards, restrained. Churches were spared. Most of the population survived. But psychologically, it was an earthquake felt around the world. Rome, the eternal city, untouched by a foreign enemy for 800 years since the Gauls. Zagged. People wept openly in Bethlehem and Africa when the news arrived. St. Jerome wrote that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken, and that his voice failed him. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the end of the world. Then came the Vandals, sweeping through Spain, crossing into North Africa, and taking the richest provinces in the west, the grain that fed Rome, the tax base that paid the army. And they built a fleet and sacked Rome again, more thoroughly, in 455. Then Attila and his Huns rode through Gaul and into Italy, and the story goes that the Pope himself rode out to meet him and somehow persuaded him to turn back. And the Western Empire simply dissolved. Britain was abandoned by the legions and left to itself. Gaul, Spain, and Africa became Germanic kingdoms. The emperors in Italy became puppets of their own barbarian generals, boys installed and deposed at will. And then, in the year 476, a Germanic commander named Augustus deposed the last one, a teenager who bore, with perfect and cruel irony, the names of both Rome's founder and its first emperor, Romulus Augustulus, little Augustus. Augustus did not even bother to kill him. He pensioned the boy off to a villa in the country and sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople with a message. The West no longer needs an emperor of its own. That was it. That was the fall of the Roman Empire. No last battle, no burning city, no final stand. A German officer retired a teenager and posted the crown to somebody else. And nobody in Italy seems to have thought at the time that anything especially historic had happened. Life went on. The Senate kept meeting. Augustus ruled Italy and was careful to be respectful. Most people probably never noticed the day the Roman Empire ended. That is how the greatest empire in Western history actually died. Not with a bang, but with a shrug and a change of management. Why did it fall? People have argued about it for 1500 years, and there is no single answer, which is itself the answer. It was everything at once, compounding. The frontiers were vast, and the manpower to hold them was gone, thinned by plague and civil war and a shrinking population. The economy was crushed by the tax burden of the army it needed, and the debased currency it had ruined. The succession was never solved, so every generation burned strength in civil wars. Rome killed far more Roman soldiers than the barbarians ever did. The rich stopped paying, and the state stopped functioning. The army stopped being Roman. The West was hollowed out to fund the East, and into that weakened structure came pressures, the Huns, the migrations, the loss of Africa's grain, that a healthy Rome would have shrugged off, and a sick one could not. There is no villain. There is just a very old, very heavy structure, weakened for centuries from the inside, that finally could not hold the weight of the world anymore. Here is the thing that almost everyone forgets, and it is one of the strangest facts in all of history. The Roman Empire did not fall in the year 476. Half of it did. The western half, Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, Africa. But the eastern half, ruled from Constantine's great city on the strait, did not fall at all. It went straight on, without a break, without a change of government, for another 1,000 years. They did not think of themselves as a new country or as Byzantines. That name was invented by scholars centuries later. They called themselves Romans because that is what they were. Their state was the Roman Empire, unbroken from Augustus. Their law was Roman law. Their emperor sat in an unbroken line from Caesar. They just happened to speak Greek and live in the East. And while Western Europe fell into centuries of poverty and disorder, they carried on. Rich, sophisticated, literate, with a functioning state, a gold coinage that held its value for centuries, universities, hospitals, and a capital that was the largest and wealthiest city in the Christian world. One of their emperors, Justinian, even tried to put it all back together, and very nearly did. His brilliant general reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, and then Italy itself, and southern Spain. And for a moment, the Mediterranean was a Roman lake again. It did not last. The wars exhausted the empire, and then a catastrophic plague swept through and killed perhaps a quarter of its people. But Justinian left behind the great codification of Roman law, and he built, in Constantinople, a cathedral of such staggering audacity, a vast golden dome that seemed to hang from heaven on a chain of light, that when he first walked into it, he is said to have thought of the greatest builder in the Bible and murmured that he had surpassed him. It stands today. It has stood for 15 centuries. And then, for the next 800 years, that Eastern Roman Empire did the hardest job in the world. It held. Islam exploded out of Arabia and took its richest provinces, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, in a single generation, and twice besieged Constantinople itself, and twice the Great Walls held. Bulgars, Persians, Slavs, Normans, Turks came at it, century after century, and it shrank and rallied and shrank again and endured. It preserved in its libraries the literature and philosophy and science of the ancient Greek world that the West had lost, Plato and Aristotle and Euclid and the rest. And when those texts eventually flowed back to a reawakening Europe, they helped ignite the Renaissance. The mortal wound, in the end, was delivered not by an enemy, but by fellow Christians. A crusade, diverted by Venetian ambition and greed, turned aside from the Holy Land and stormed and sacked Constantinople itself in the year 1204, burning and looting the greatest city in Christendom, melting down its bronzes, stripping its churches. The empire eventually recovered the city, but never recovered from the blow. It limped on for 2 more centuries as a shadow, a few provinces, and a magnificent, half-empty capital. And the end came on the 29th of May, in the year 1453. The Ottoman Turks came with an enormous army and something the world had not seen before. Cannon of monstrous size, one of them so large it took 60 oxen to drag, and could hurl a stone ball weighing half a ton, capable at last of breaking the great walls that had held for 1,000 years. The city had perhaps 7,000 defenders, against maybe 80,000 attackers. There was no hope, and everyone knew it. The last emperor was named Constantine, the same name as the man who had founded the city 1,100 years earlier, which nobody failed to notice. He was offered his life and a principality if he would surrender. He refused. He spent the last evening going around the walls with his commanders, and then attended a final service in the great cathedral, where Catholic and Orthodox worshipped together one last time, and then went back to the walls. When the walls were breached at dawn, he took off his imperial regalia so that he could not be identified, drew his sword, and charged into the breach with his men. His body was never found. And with that, the Roman Empire, founded by tradition in 753 before our era, in a village of shepherds and outlaws on a hill by a river, came to an end, 2,200 years later, on a wall in Turkey, with a Constantine dying anonymously in a breach, defending the city that another Constantine had built. It is one of the longest continuous stories in human history, and hardly anybody knows it lasted that long. So the story ends. A village of shepherds on a muddy hill became the master of the world, and held it for centuries, and then came apart, slowly, from the inside, over generations, until a German officer retired a teenager in Italy, and the whole thing was quietly over in the West. while the East carried the name for another millennia before dying on a wall in the smoke and the cannon fire. And yet, in the way that matters, Rome never really left. It is still here, all around us, so thoroughly woven into the world that we mostly cannot see it. You can see it in the obvious places. The roads still running under Europe's highways. The aqueducts still standing in Spain and France. The Pantheon's dome, still perfect after 19 centuries. Amphitheaters across 3 continents. But mostly Rome survives in the invisible things. In the law, as we have seen, the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the sanctity of contract, the very shape of legal reasoning across most of the world. In language, Latin did not die, it just scattered. It became Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and it poured into English so completely that most of the long words in this sentence are Roman. In the calendar on your wall, with its months named for Roman gods and Roman emperors, fixed by Julius Caesar and barely touched since. In the alphabet, these words are written in. In the shape of politics, the Senate, the Republic, the Constitution, the veto, the idea of citizenship as a legal status carrying rights, the notion that power should be divided and limited and temporary, that magistrates should answer for their conduct when they leave office. When the founders of the American Republic argued about how to build a state, they argued in Roman terms, using Roman examples, writing under Roman pseudonyms, terrified of exactly the thing that had killed the Roman Republic, a popular general with an army and too much ambition. They built a senate and a capital and put eagles on everything, because for 2,000 years in the West, Rome has been the word for what a state is supposed to look like. And in the religion of a large fraction of humanity, which is Roman in its structure and its language and its geography, a church with its center in Rome, its liturgy long in Latin, its bishops seated in the old provincial capitals, its titles borrowed from the imperial administration. The empire converted the church, quite as much as the church converted the empire, and when the Western Empire died, the church inherited its shape and carried it through the dark centuries that followed. Even Rome's fall became one of the most powerful ideas in history. Every empire since, every single one has looked at Rome and seen either a model or a warning, and usually both. When people worry today about whether their own society is decadent or overstretched or rotting from within, the argument is always conducted in Roman terms. Rome is the mirror the West has held up to itself for 1,500 years. If there is a lesson in the whole long arc, it is probably not the one people usually reach for. Rome did not fall because it grew decadent, whatever the moralists say. It fell because it was very old, very large, and very heavy, and it had a flaw at its heart it never fixed, no rules for who holds power next. So it spent its strength, generation after generation, on itself. Rome killed more Romans than every barbarian ever did. And the thing that made it great in the beginning was the thing it lost at the end. The capacity to compromise, to absorb, to bring the outsider in and make him one of us. When Rome was a small city that turned its defeated enemies into citizens, it was unstoppable. When it became an empire that could not settle an argument without a civil war, it was finished. It just took 400 years to fall over. And the other lesson, the quieter one, is the one the Roman general felt as he watched Carthage burn and wept, because he understood that he was looking at Rome's own future. Nothing lasts. Not the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Not 1,000 years of law and roads and legions. Not the eternal city itself. It all ends. The Romans could not imagine a world without Rome, any more than we can imagine a world without whatever we are certain is permanent. And then, one ordinary afternoon in Italy, without much ceremony, it simply stopped. That is not a sad thought, really. It is a restful one. Everything that seemed so urgent to all those people, The elections, the ambitions, the feuds, the empire itself has long since gone quiet. And it is all right that it did. They lived and built and argued and fought and left behind the roads and the law and the words. And then they let go, and the world went on. And here we are, 2 millennia later, in the warmth and the dark, remembering them. Let it all grow quiet now, and settle and drift away. The twins and the wolf at the river's edge. The wall and the brother who leapt it, and the brother who killed him. Lucretia's knife, and the oath in the forum, and a republic born. The geese on the Capitol. Hannibal's elephants in the snow of the Alps, and the terrible field at Cannae, and a stubborn city that would not admit it had lost. Scipio at Zama, and Carthage burning, and a general weeping because he understood. The Gracchi in the street, Sulla's lists, Caesar at the river in the dark, saying the die is cast. The daggers in the Senate house, a frail young man who gave back the titles and kept the power, and a peace that lasted 200 years. A madman and his horse, a philosopher writing to himself in a tent on the frontier, telling himself to be good. The dome open to the sky, the roads running out to the edges of the world, the walls of Constantinople holding for 1,000 years, and a last Constantine drawing his sword in the breach. All of it over now, all of it long since gone quiet. You don't have to carry any of it. It all happened and it all finished a very long time ago. The arguments settled, the ambitions spent, the empire fallen, the dust long since blown off the roads. There is nothing left in any of it that needs anything from you tonight. So let the whole vast thing blur and fade. The legions and the marble, the emperors and the mob, the 1,000 years of it. And let yourself sink down out of the noise of history into the deep, still quiet underneath, where no empire rises and none falls, and nothing at all is required of you. Rest now. Rome held its watch for a millennium, and then laid it down and slept. So can you. And when the dark comes down again, I'll be here to carry you off to another time long ago, while the wonder of it still stands. Sleep well.